Picture this. You are led through marbled halls, the air thick with incense and fear. Before you sits the most powerful man in the world, the emperor, his eyes holding a chilling emptiness. He dismisses the guards, and you are left alone. He speaks of a grotesque, twisted honor he intends to bestow upon you, a procedure that will remake you in the image of his dead wife. This is the horrific reality for male concubines in Imperial Rome. The story of Sporus does not begin in the gilded cage of the Palatine Hill, but in the anonymous squalor of a provincial town, a place where the grasp of Rome was felt not as a civilizing hand, but as an iron fist. He was a boy of no notable lineage, possessing only a delicate, almost feminine beauty that would become both his currency and his curse. In the 1st century AD, the Roman world was a tapestry woven with threads of brutal pragmatism and decadent excess. Power was absolute, and the whims of the powerful could reshape reality itself. For a boy like Sporus, freedom was a concept as abstract as the gods. He was likely a puer delicatus, a child slave selected for his looks, destined for a life of servitude where the lines between servant, companion, and plaything were deliberately, terrifyingly blurred. His early life would have been a systematic stripping away of identity. His name, his history, his very will were sanded down until all that remained was a pleasing vessel, an object designed to reflect the desires of his master. Imagine the psychological conditioning required to learn that your survival depends on your ability to anticipate and satisfy the unspoken, often depraved appetites of another. This was the world that forged Sporus long before he ever caught the eye of the Emperor Nero. Nero himself was a paradox, a monster wrapped in the robes of an artist. He was a man of profound insecurities, his reign a frantic, bloody ballet of self-aggrandizement. His initial years on the throne were guided by wiser heads like Seneca and Burrus, but their influence waned as the emperor's paranoia, a cancer fed by absolute power, began to metastasize. He saw conspiracies in every shadow, betrayal in every friendly face. His cruelty was not merely political, it was deeply, intimately personal. He had his own mother, Agrippina, murdered. He kicked his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, to death in a fit of rage. It was in the grief-stricken, guilt-ridden aftermath of Poppaea's death that Nero's gaze fell upon Sporus. The resemblance was uncanny, a cruel trick of fate. In Sporus, Nero saw not a person, but a ghost, a chance to reclaim what he had destroyed. The boy's misfortune was to be a near-perfect echo of the dead empress, and for that, Nero decided he would possess him, not just as a concubine, but as a grotesque parody of a wife. The gears of the imperial machine began to turn, set in motion by a tyrant's grief-fueled fantasy, and Sporus, the boy from nowhere, was about to be dragged into the very heart of the storm. The system that allowed this was as monstrous as the man at its head. It was a court of whispers, of sycophants and enforcers, where morality was a luxury few could afford and survival was the only virtue. The transition from the obscurity of a slave's life to the blinding spotlight of the imperial court was a disorienting, terrifying ordeal for Sporus. He was brought to the palace, a sprawling labyrinth of power and intrigue where every smile concealed a dagger and every word was weighed for hidden meaning. Here, he was no longer just a slave, he was a project, a canvas upon which the emperor would paint his twisted masterpiece. The first step in this horrifying transformation was the most brutal and irreversible. Nero, in his madness, did not simply want a companion who looked like his dead wife. He wanted a wife. He summoned his most trusted physicians, men whose hands were as skilled at preserving life as they were at ending it. Their task was to erase Sporus's masculinity, to physically reshape him into the image of Poppaea. Can you imagine the sheer terror of that moment? To be held down, to have your body irrevocably altered by the cold, clinical hands of men who see you not as a human being but as a piece of clay to be molded to a tyrant's will. The procedure was castration, a brutal, life-threatening act performed with the crude instruments of the time. There was no anesthesia, only the grim, practiced efficiency of the surgeons and the muffled screams of the victim. Sporus survived, but the boy he had been was gone forever, sacrificed on the altar of Nero's obsession. The physical pain would have been immense, a searing agony that would fade to a dull, constant ache. But the psychological wound was far deeper, a permanent mutilation of his identity. He was now a thing, a creation, trapped in a body that was no longer his own. Following the surgery, the next phase of his dehumanization began. He was dressed in the fine silks and jewels of the dead empress. Tutors were assigned to teach him the mannerisms, the gait, the soft vocal inflections of Poppaea. He was forced to study her life, to become a living echo of a dead woman. His own name was stripped away in public. He was now to be addressed as Sabina. The court, a collection of ambitious and terrified individuals, played along with the horrifying charade. To do otherwise would be to question the emperor's sanity, a fatal misstep. They bowed to Sporus, they called him empress, they treated him with the feigned reverence due to Nero's wife. Every interaction was a fresh layer of humiliation, a reminder of his powerlessness. He was the ghost at the feast, a walking, breathing symbol of Nero's descent into madness. His life became a public performance of a grotesque fantasy, a play where he was the unwilling star, and the only audience that mattered was the increasingly unhinged emperor. The imperial court of Nero was a microcosm of the Roman Empire itself, a rigid hierarchy built on a foundation of fear and ambition. At the apex was the emperor, a god in his own mind, and below him were the concentric circles of power senators, equestrians, freedmen, and slaves. Within this structure, a unique and morally compromised class of individuals thrived, the complicit system enforcers. These were the men and women who, through a combination of self-preservation, ambition, and desensitization, became the instruments of the tyrant's will. They were the physicians who held the knife to Sporus, their medical ethics dissolving in the face of an imperial command. They were the tutors who meticulously coached the boy in the art of being a dead woman, their knowledge perverted to serve a grotesque fantasy. They were the chamberlains who dressed him in Poppaea's gowns, the guards who secured his gilded cage, and the courtiers who bowed and scraped before this tragic parody of an empress. One of the most prominent figures in this circle of complicity was Tigellinus, the Praetorian prefect. A man of low birth and high ambition, Tigellinus had risen to power by pandering to Nero's darkest impulses. He was the emperor's enabler, his chief sycophant, and the architect of many of his most brutal policies. It was Tigellinus who would have overseen the logistics of Sporus's transformation, ensuring the physicians were compliant, the secret was kept, and the court fell in line. He would have seen Sporus not as a victim, but as a tool means to further entrench himself in the emperor's favor. His interactions with Sporus would have been a chilling blend of feigned respect and cold calculation. He would address the boy as Domina, my lady, while his eyes conveyed the cold reality of Sporus's situation. You are property. Then there were the physicians, men of science and learning, sworn to heal. How could they justify their actions? Perhaps they rationalized it as a medical necessity, a treatment for the emperor's profound grief. Or perhaps, more likely, they understood the simple, brutal calculus of power in Nero's Rome. Refuse the emperor, and you and your family would pay the price. Their complicity was a quiet, clinical horror, the perversion of a noble profession to serve a monstrous end. They would have monitored Sporus's recovery, treating his wounds while ignoring the deeper wound to his soul. They were the mechanics of his dehumanization. The entire court was drawn into this conspiracy of silence. To acknowledge the truth of Sporus's situation was to acknowledge the emperor's madness, and that was a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. So they participated in the charade, their forced smiles and hollow pleasantries a constant, suffocating reminder to Sporus of his utter isolation. He was surrounded by people, yet completely, terrifyingly alone, a living spectacle in a theater of the absurd, where the only applause that mattered came from the hands of a tyrant. The public culmination of this private horror was a wedding ceremony. Nero, not content with merely possessing a living effigy of his dead wife, decided to marry Sporus. The event was a grotesque public spectacle, a perversion of one of society's most sacred rights. An official marriage contract was drawn up, a dowry was paid, and Sporus, veiled and dressed as a bride, was formally wed to the Emperor of Rome. The ceremony was attended by the highest echelons of Roman society, their faces a mixture of feigned celebration and ill-concealed disgust. They watched as Nero took the arm of his bride, as vows were exchanged, as the emperor kissed the boy he now called his wife. Can you imagine the psychological torture of that moment for Sporus? To be the centerpiece of such a profoundly humiliating ritual, to have your degradation celebrated as a joyous union. It was the ultimate act of dehumanization, a public declaration that he was no longer a person, but a possession, a living doll for a grieving, demented tyrant. The wedding was followed by a tour of Greece, a journey that was part public relations exercise and part honeymoon. Nero, who fancied himself a great artist, participated in the Olympic Games and other artistic competitions, collecting prizes that no one dared deny him. And at his side, always, was Sporus, the silent, beautiful empress. They traveled in opulent splendor, a moving island of imperial power and private madness. For Sporus, it was a journey through a waking nightmare. He was paraded before cheering crowds who knew the truth but dared not speak it. He attended lavish banquets where he sat in the place of honor, a silent, tragic figure amidst the forced revelry. He was a constant, public reminder of the emperor's absolute power, the power to kill, to create, and to warp reality itself. The nights were surely the worst, alone with the man who was his husband, his master, his tormentor. What passed between them in the privacy of the imperial chambers? We can only speculate, but the historical sources, though hostile to Nero, paint a grim picture. Nero's affection was likely a smothering, possessive thing, a desperate attempt to recapture the love he had destroyed. For Sporus, it would have been an experience devoid of warmth or tenderness, an act of submission to the man who had mutilated his body and stolen his identity. His life was a constant performance, a tightrope walk over a chasm of imperial rage. A single misstep, a moment of defiance, a flicker of his old self, could have meant a swift and brutal end. He had to be Poppaea, always. The twisted fantasy could not last. The Roman world, for all its decadence, was a deeply conservative society, and Nero's increasingly erratic behavior was eroding the foundations of his power. The marriage to Sporus was not just a personal scandal, it was a political liability. It was seen as a sign of his unfitness to rule, a grotesque indulgence that offended the gods and the sensibilities of the Roman elite. While Nero was touring Greece with his bride, discontent was brewing back in Rome. The legions on the frontiers were growing restless, and ambitious governors saw an opportunity to challenge the unstable emperor. In the year 68 AD, the dam of resentment finally broke. The governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, Gaius Julius Vindex, openly rebelled against Nero. Soon after, Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, joined the revolt and declared himself emperor. The news sent shockwaves through Nero's entourage. The fantasy was shattered, replaced by the cold, hard reality of civil war. Nero and his court rushed back to Rome, but it was too late. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, declared Nero a public enemy. His guards deserted him, his friends abandoned him, and the man who had once been a living god was now a fugitive in his own city. In his final, desperate hours, Nero fled the palace, accompanied by a handful of loyal freedmen and, by some accounts, by Sporus. As they hid in a squalid villa outside the city, the full weight of his downfall crashed down upon him. He was a man stripped of everything: his power, his prestige, his adoring crowds. Faced with the prospect of a humiliating public execution, Nero decided to take his own life. But even in this final act, his nerve failed him. He lamented, "What an artist dies in me," but could not bring himself to drive the dagger home. It was his secretary, Epaphroditus, who had to guide his hand. As Nero lay dying, he reportedly turned to Sporus and begged the boy to begin the lamentations, to weep for him as a wife would for her husband. It was one final, pathetic demand, one last attempt to impose his fantasy on reality. What did Sporus feel in that moment? Relief? Pity? Numbness? To have his tormentor die before his eyes, to be finally free from the suffocating grip of his obsessionate, must have been a complex, overwhelming flood of emotion. The death of Nero did not, however, bring Sporus a return to normalcy. He was now a figure of notoriety, a living symbol of the dead tyrant's excesses. His ordeal was far from over. The fall of a tyrant rarely brings immediate peace. The power vacuum left by Nero's death plunged the Roman Empire into a year of bloody civil war, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian would all claim the throne in rapid succession, each reign beginning with purges and ending in violence. For Sporus, the end of Nero's life was simply the beginning of a new chapter of exploitation. He was a tainted prize, a curiosity passed from one powerful man to another. His beauty, which had been his initial curse, continued to define his fate. He was immediately taken in by Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious Praetorian prefect who had betrayed Nero and briefly harbored his own imperial ambitions. Sabinus, in a twisted imitation of his former master, also married Sporus and began calling him Poppaea. He saw the boy as a symbol of continuity, a way to connect himself to the Neronian legacy he hoped to usurp. For Sporus, it was a horrifying echo of his past trauma, a confirmation that he was not a person but a possession, his identity forever tied to the dead empress and the dead emperor. But Sabinus's grasp for power was short-lived. He was killed by his own Praetorian guards when they declared their allegiance to Galba. Sporus was once again unmoored, a piece of human wreckage in the storm of Roman politics. His next master was Otho, who had been the original husband of the real Poppaea Sabina before Nero forced him to divorce her. Otho, a man known for his own decadent tastes, became emperor after orchestrating the assassination of Galba. He too took an interest in Sporus, though the nature of their relationship is less clear. Some sources suggest Otho treated him with a degree of kindness, perhaps seeing in him a tragic reflection of the wife they had both, in a sense, lost to Nero. But any hope of a stable, peaceful existence was an illusion. Otho's reign lasted a mere 3 months before he was defeated in battle by the forces of Vitellius. Rather than face capture, Otho committed suicide, an act praised by some historians for its dignity and for sparing Rome further bloodshed. With Otho's death, Sporus's fate fell into the hands of Vitellius, an emperor notorious for his gluttony and cruelty. Vitellius had no interest in continuing the charade of Sporus as an empress. Instead, he planned to use the boy for a far more public and brutal form of humiliation. The final act of Sporus's tragedy was perhaps the most cruel and degrading of all. The Emperor Vitellius, a man whose brief reign was characterized by grotesque excess and public spectacle, decided to make an example of the boy. He saw Sporus not as a person, not even as a political symbol, but as mere stage dressing for a bloody piece of theater. Vitellius planned to feature Sporus in a gladiatorial spectacle, a public performance where the boy would be forced to play the lead role in a mythological rape scene, specifically the story of the rape of Proserpina. This was the ultimate degradation. After being forced to live as a woman, to be the bride of emperors, he was now to be publicly, performatively violated for the entertainment of the Roman mob. The act was designed to be the final, crushing humiliation, a public stripping away of any last shred of dignity he might have possessed. It was a statement of power by Vitellius, a way to mock the memory of his predecessors, Nero and Otho, by defiling one of their most famous possessions. For Sporus, this was a fate worse than death. He had endured castration, psychological torture, and the constant fear of a violent end. He had survived the fall of 2 emperors, but the prospect of this final, public degradation was too much to bear. He was trapped, with no powerful protector left to shield him. The system that had created him was now about to devour him in the most public way imaginable. Faced with this unbearable future, Sporus made his final choice. It was the only act of agency he had left. He chose to end his own life. The exact method of his suicide is not recorded, but the act itself speaks volumes. It was a final, desperate act of defiance, a refusal to be a pawn in another man's cruel game. He chose the oblivion of death over the certainty of public violation. His suicide was a quiet, tragic end to a life lived in the glare of a horrific spotlight. He died as he had lived for years, alone and a victim of the whims of powerful, cruel men. He was likely no older than 20. The story of Sporus is a dark footnote in the grand, bloody narrative of the Roman Empire. He is a ghost in the historical record, a figure defined entirely by the actions of others. We do not know his real name, his family, or what he truly thought or felt. He exists only as a reflection of Nero's madness, a testament to the absolute corruption of unchecked power. His life serves as a chilling reminder that behind the marble facades and triumphant arches of Rome lay a world of profound human suffering, a system that could casually, almost thoughtlessly, destroy a human soul for the amusement of a tyrant. Can we even begin to comprehend the depth of his trauma? To have your body and identity stolen, to be forced into a grotesque parody of womanhood, to be passed between powerful men like a trinket, and to finally be slated for public ritualized violation. His story is an extreme example, but it speaks to a broader truth about the nature of power and the vulnerability of those caught in its gears. The complicit enablers, the physicians, the courtiers, the prefects are as much a part of this story as Nero himself. They represent the moral rot that sets in when fear and ambition override basic human decency. They chose to be the instruments of cruelty, and in doing so, they share in the guilt. The story of Sporus forces us to look beyond the great men and epic battles that dominate our understanding of history. It demands that we remember the forgotten victims, the nameless, faceless individuals whose lives were consumed by the fires of someone else's ambition or madness. It is a story about the human cost of empire, the dark underbelly of a civilization we often glorify. In the end, Sporus's suicide was his only victory. It was a tragic, desperate act, but it was his own. In choosing death, he denied Vitellius his spectacle. He denied the Roman mob their entertainment. He reclaimed, in the only way he could, a final measure of control over his own fate. He remains a haunting, silent witness to the horrific things one human being can do to another when given absolute power. The silence that surrounds the life of Sporus in the historical record is, in itself, a form of violence. Roman historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all mention him, but they do so with a tone of aristocratic disdain and moral condemnation aimed squarely at Nero. For them, Sporus is not a victim to be pitied, but evidence of Nero's perversion, his un-Roman character, his unfitness to rule. Tacitus, the great senatorial historian, writes with a clipped, contemptuous brevity, focusing on the outrage of the public marriage ceremony. Suetonius, a biographer with a taste for scandalous gossip, lingers on the lurid details: the castration, the wedding, the name Poppaea, using them to paint a portrait of a monstrously decadent emperor. Cassius Dio, writing over a century later, compiles these accounts, adding his own moralizing commentary. In all of these narratives, Sporus himself is a phantom. He has no voice, no interior life. His suffering is merely a dramatic device, a tool used to condemn a hated emperor. There is no empathy for the boy who was mutilated and psychologically tortured. The horror they express is not for the victim, but for the violation of Roman social norms. The castration of a freeborn boy was illegal, but Sporus was likely a slave, a non-person in the eyes of the law and the elite historians. The real crime, in their view, was the public spectacle, the marriage, the elevation of a pure delicatus to the status of an empress. It was an offense against the rigid social order, a mockery of the institutions they held sacred. This conspiratorial silence, this deliberate framing of the narrative, served a political purpose. By focusing on Nero's sexual and personal depravities, these historians, all members of the elite class that had suffered under him, could justify his overthrow and legitimize the new ruling dynasty. Nero's personal failings were conflated with his political failings, and Sporus became a convenient symbol of both. The truth of his experience was lost, buried under layers of political invective and sensationalism. We are left to read between the lines, to reconstruct a human story from the hostile fragments left behind by men who saw him as, at best, a pathetic curiosity, and at worst, an accomplice in Nero's crimes against Roman dignity. This is how history is often written, by the victors, by the powerful, and by those whose voices are privileged enough to be recorded. The voices of the victims, the powerless, the silent, are so often erased, leaving behind only whispers and shadows. The life and death of Sporus, while a uniquely horrific tale, is ultimately inseparable from the larger story of the Roman world's relationship with power and sexuality. The Romans, particularly the elite, had a complex and often contradictory set of attitudes. On one hand, there was a degree of tolerance for same-sex relationships, but it was governed by a strict, unwritten code of dominance and submission. For a freeborn Roman citizen, the active, dominant role was acceptable. The passive, submissive role was a source of deep shame and social stigma, as it implied effeminacy and a lack of self-control. The cardinal virtues of a Roman man. This is why Nero's actions were so scandalous. It was not merely that he took a male lover. but that he elevated him to the status of a wife, publicly taking on a role that blurred the lines of acceptable masculine behavior. His actions were seen as a symptom of a deeper sickness, a loss of the virtus, manly virtue, that was supposed to define an emperor. This societal hypocrisy created a dark and predatory sexual economy. The demand for beautiful young slaves, both male and female, was immense. These individuals, like Sporus, had no rights, no protection. They were property, subject to the absolute whims of their masters. Their bodies were battlegrounds for the power dynamics of the elite. The story of Sporus is the story of this system taken to its most logical and horrifying conclusion. He was the ultimate object, a human being so completely stripped of agency that he could be physically and psychologically remade into a living fantasy. His tragedy highlights the profound dehumanization that lay at the heart of Roman slavery. Furthermore, the tale reflects the inherent instability of absolute power. An emperor like Nero, surrounded by sycophants and insulated from criticism, could lose all touch with reality. His private obsessions, his personal demons, were allowed to fester and grow until they spilled out into the public sphere with catastrophic consequences. His sexual dysfunction, his grief, and his paranoia were not just personal problems. They became matters of state. The system that gave him absolute power also ensured that there were no checks on his madness. In the end, the story of Sporus is more than just a shocking historical anecdote. It is a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of power, the fragility of identity, and the ease with which a society can sacrifice its most vulnerable members on the altar of tradition, ambition, and fear. It is a somber reflection on the enduring human capacity for cruelty and the quiet, desperate struggles of those who are caught in the unforgiving machinery of history.